I think the most important thing here is to start asking about the very notion of sexuality. What does sexuality mean? If we, and this question I'm basically inspired by what Foucault wrote in the history of the first volume of the history of sexuality here, when he discusses the notion of sexuality as a fictional unit, and he questions the very existence of sexuality as something that is a given. If we consider that sexuality involves things that range from penis-vagina intercourse to licking a boot, and going through masturbation and sadomasochism and a lot of very different practices that really have nothing in common. Some of them involve the genitals, some of them involve other erotogenic zones, other body parts. Some involve actual actions, some are representations, some are fantasies. There's really no shared element between all of these things that supposedly constitute sexuality. Today it's difficult to kind of realize that, and to realize that sexuality is a social construction, because I think it's become so naturalized in a way as a field of experience that's kind of like self-evident, that we don't even interrogate the idea of the existence of sexuality. In fact, if you try to look for a definition of sexuality, you will not find one. Most people who study sexuality will not provide a definition, will just assume that it exists. And if you look into the dictionary, you'll find very elusive definitions or tautological definitions, such as sexuality, what pertains to the sexual. And when you try to go back, it'll go, it's an unending tautology there. You can say, well, sexuality is about pleasure and desire, but we all know that there are pleasures and desires that are clearly of non-sexual nature, and that we experience as non-sexual, and others that we experience as sexual. So what is that all of these things that we call sexual share? And I think it's in asking this question that we can understand Freud much better. The 19th century needed to define sexuality, and the normal pathological paradigm allowed a way of grouping all of these things together. So normal sexuality was reproductive and genital. Everything else was a deviation from that. Now, usually we understand this building of the normal pathological paradigm as something that actually is meant to exercise a form of social control, to create others, to separate and marginalize all of those people that do not engage in the so-called normal sexuality. But even if that is true in terms of social control, epistemologically, I think it's fundamental to realize that the normal pathological paradigm is trying to conceptualize a unity. And Freud makes a huge emphasis on this in the three essays. He says we have to understand that the pathological is constitutive of the normal, that the pathological, in a way, is what allows us to understand sexuality as a unit. It's what allows us to classify all of these things together. Without this notion of the deviation, how can we conceptualize the unity there? That's a 19th century worry, and I don't think Freud is doing anything new in that sense, but I think that the one very original element that Freud introduces is the theory of recapitulation. And sometimes in the three essays it's not clear that he's using this, but I think it's fundamental to understand that that's the underlying theory that's working out there. In the 19th century, the theory of recapitulation was very prominent in evolutionary views in general, portrayed an evolution of sexuality where heterosexuality was a telos, the end towards which everything was oriented. So let me mention a few things. Like in natural history, you see the evolution from asexual cells to hermaphroditic organisms, to then a later stage of dimorphic division between male and female. So you can see how it starts with something that the asexual cells, we could compare it with the polymorphous perversity, then we can see a second stage in which there's no differentiation of sexes, and finally there's something where there's a very clear distinction of male and female. That's a natural history. Now in social evolution we see something very similar. If you think about Engels and the origin of the family, private property, and the state, he's saying, well, primitive communism, the first stages of social evolution, there's basically no norms applied to sexuality. Sexuality is some kind of like free will thing that has no aim and no object, and it's not restricted to a specific kind of sexuality. As you progress throughout history, we'll see more norms and restrictions that will finally lead to a system where everyone is trained into becoming heterosexual, where there's a norm of heterosexuality. That's the pinnacle of like civilization, right? Same thing you can observe in embryology, for instance. So the embryo begins as an asexual embryo. It then later becomes a hermaphroditic embryo, and finally you see the distinction between male and female. And this idea that both the natural evolution, that social evolution, that embryology, that all forms of evolution led towards an end in time that was heterosexual, that was very clearly divided between male and female, was embedded in 19th century thinking. And the idea that each one of these stages was recapitulating the former one, right? So in a way, social evolution was recapitulating the history of the species. And at the same time, the embryology was recapitulating the history of the species. What Freud will say is, well, the history of the individual is basically recapitulating the history of the species too, which is this idea that he's taking from Ernst. Well, I think Ernst Haeckel is the one that formulated it in a more clear sense. And he's saying that this is fundamental to understand the development of sexuality, and I think that's where his understanding of the evolution of the individual sexual development that starts with the oral, well, polymorphous, perversity, oral, anal, genital is coming from. In doing that, the individual is recapitulating that the kind of sexual development that the species did, and also that happened throughout social evolution. You can even see how the recapitulation happens at the stage of the sexual act. So the sexual act does not start genital; it starts oral, kissing and fondling, and it's kind of like it doesn't have a clear object or aim, and then it starts focusing into the oral, into different stages. It's not always very clearly defined, but the end stage is the genital stage. So there's again a recapitulation there of the sexual development of the individual in the very sexual act, in the very supposedly normal sexual act. There's the same stages there. And what Freud is going to do is to take this idea of recapitulation into developing this idea to its logical consequences. And say, well, when you see the evolution from one stage to the next, it's not like the previous stage is just something that's abandoned and disappears, and no, there's a repression, but that repression means that it will return as a symptom somehow. So what we have is the development of actually two types of pathology. The pathology that implies arrested development, meaning you were left in a previous stage of development, instead of evolving towards heterosexuality, which is supposed to be pinnacle, you were left in, like, you were the unfortunate homosexual, you couldn't evolve into that. That's one possible pathology. But the other pathology is if you actually evolved into heterosexuality, it means that by repressing everything else, all of that will come through symptoms, and you will be neurotic, hysterical, or anything else, and any other of the, what I call the pathologies of the normal. So in a way, you have two sorts of pathologies rather than normality and pathology. By making everything pathological, then Freud is actually normalizing everything, because if everything is equally normal, then if everything is equally pathological, then everything is equally normal too. The concept of pathological can be applied to everything. Basically, it makes no sense as pathology itself. And I think we can only understand this if we grasp the theory of recapitulation. Now, in a way, the theory of recapitulation sounds like a totally, say, fantastic myth. Some kind of, what is this idea that there's like a timing that evolves towards heterosexuality, or the idea of a telos is so foreign to us today after all the critiques to evolutionism and the challenges to teleological views. But I think Freud is grasping something that is fundamental. I think we need to criticize teleology, but at the same time, in doing that, we shouldn't miss what I call the directionality of history. I think there are changes that are happening at the time that Freud is writing that have a clear direction. And I will call this the transition from cities of sin to family sociability. That's happening in the late 19th, early 20th century when Freud is developing his work. The 19th century is connecting parts of the world that were never connected before, with the development of railways, of shipping lines, of an international world market of a size and dimension that have never ever existed before, where societies are becoming codependent, where what another society in another part of the world produces becomes a requirement for the very reproduction of some other area of the world. And exchange of commodity exchange becomes crucial for the very reproduction of society, of very different societies worldwide. In this exchange, something that will happen is that new cities will emerge. There's a fast process of urbanization that's happening globally. And we can see a pattern of emergence of what I call cities of sin, where you see mass migration of disproportionately men, and in most cases single men. So let me give you an example. Like Singapore has a proportion of 14 men per 1 woman during the late 19th, early 20th century. Buenos Aires doesn't have something as big as this, but it also has a huge disproportion of men. Same we can say about cities like New York, Nairobi, Shanghai. Historians that have worked on this have seen this huge disproportion. These men are not just going to the cities to look for jobs. I mean, that's a good reason for why they're going, but they also have expectations of sexual adventures in the cities. And with the disproportion of men, we see a huge rise of female prostitution in the cities. And we see also a lot of these men having sex with one another. They're away from their families. There's no peer control. There's a situation where they're very mobile also. This is a very mobile job market and very unstable. And they're circulating even from one part of the city to the next. They don't know one another. Family sociability is very weak. And sex between men is very common. Also, the fact that there's temporary unemployment and some of the characteristics of the urban structure, of the social structure of these rising cities leads to crime and to the formation of a huge urban underground that exists in many of the cities of the world that sometimes is like kind of a forgotten phenomenon that Freud refers to in different ways as something that is known at the time, but today is kind of forgotten. But at the same time, with a different chronology in different parts of the world, we see an evolution from these cities that had a huge urban underworld and a huge sexual scene in the streets that was very visible, a huge phenomenon of female prostitution, sex in the streets, people masturbating in the streets and the parks. Now, you can find that in so many cities of the world at that time. You see an evolution from that to the formation of suburbs, family life, and the decline of female prostitution, the decline of public sex. And this transition that's happening in different cities of the world between the late 19th and mid-20th century is something that Freud is observing. So this kind of directionality of history that I call this is crucial to understand Freud's idea of the recapitulation theory. I mean, I think he's grasping this in a very distorted manner through scientificist views of the 19th century, rather than understanding it as a phenomenon of historical transformation related to capitalist modernity. But as we reconceptualize this from a historical point of view, I think we should ask to what extent, how could we reformulate Freud's ideas, but without losing the idea of the directionality and trying to understand his notion of sexual pathology from that point of view, rather than just discarding the recapitulation theory and the notion of telos as a mere myth. So that's the question that I wanted to pose today to everyone.
Thank you.
In a sense, what I'm going to try to do is fill in a few details from what Pablo's been saying, and perhaps talk about this specifically close to Freud. Freud's thinking about virtually everything, but particularly about sexuality, is totally incomprehensible, I believe, without conceptualizing it in terms of the contexts, and context has an S at the end of it, the historical context in which he's operating. Freud, however, oddly does not see himself within historical context in terms of a self-critique, so that one of the things that's profoundly missing, for example, from the three essays, is any recognition that the universal concepts which he puts forward, what he claims to be universal, may be historically determined, may reflect the moment of the writing, the influences on him. For someone who was so acutely aware of the personal influences on his writing, it's absolutely remarkable that he seems to believe that he exists in a world in which you can describe universals of human beings as though they were independent of culture, independent of anything very much other than some core quality. Now, that takes us to why would Freud think such a thing? Why? And this is the first of the historical contexts in which I want to place his writing. Freud was a passionate advocate from the time that he was a medical student of a fundamental 19th century program of reductionism. He had his immediate research teacher, Ernst Brücke, had sworn in an oath in 1856, along with Helmholtz and others, that we will reduce all of biological phenomena to the principles of physics and chemistry. Now, that by 1900, when Freud writes The Interpretation of Dreams, he has this understanding that he can't reduce it all to physics and chemistry. Remember in chapter 7, he says, you know, psychological explanation is different from biological, that is, physical, chemical explanations. But he still has this desire to have something foundational out of which everything can grow. Universal principles analogous to those of physics and chemistry from which he can develop everything. Prior to 1905, he had hoped for the concept of psychic energy to fill that need. And energy roughly equivalent to that of physics, and he tries to do this. He works with it and works with it, and it doesn't work well enough. I believe that he replaces it in large measure in 1905 in the 3 essays with a foundational idea of something he calls sexuality. This is a universal principle which can explain everything through its vicissitudes. A point of reduction to which you can take everything back. And as Pablo points out, he nowhere defines what sexuality is, except in a footnote, which I haven't been able to relocate, so I hope this isn't a parapraxis. But the footnote says, very much like the Supreme Court in pornography, we know what sexuality is. It's that by which we are repelled. And he defines sexuality, insofar as he does at all, negatively, in terms of a reaction against it. Now, as Pablo pointed out, Freud was very much engaged with the biological conceptualizations of development. Remember that his first researches were investigations of it was a fascinating research for later Freud, the disappearance of the testicles of eels as they matured. And one wonders how on earth he got onto that. But he dissected something over 300 eels to follow this. And what he's doing at that point is carrying out an aspect of a major theme of late 19th century biology, that is the notion that to study embryology is to study the core of biological being. This is an idea that Frank Soloway develops very extensively in his book, Freud, Biologist of the Mind. What Freud is doing in the 3 essays is essentially taking that embryological point of view and applying it to sexual function. In so doing, this is another foundational organizing concept which he'll use over and over again. And he'll use the concept which is so appealing and looks so good from Haeckel that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. That is, the biological evolution of the organism is recapitulated in the embryological evolution of the organism. And in a very odd way, a very interesting way, he gets culture into the individual that way. That is, he brings along this notion that culture, that in our development, we move toward a culturally satisfactory position, that is normative heterosexuality, by virtue of repeating cultural phenomena which can be seen elsewhere. Now, it's very interesting to me that this isn't something Freud comes up with on his own. Let me read something to you. I'll ask people to identify from whence this comes. It is of great psychological interest to follow up the gradual development of civilization and the influence exerted by sexual life upon habits and morality. The gratification of the sexual instinct seems to be the primary motive in man as well as beast. Sexual intercourse is done openly, and men and women are not ashamed of their nakedness. The savage races, for example, Australians, Polynesian, Malays of the Philippines, are still in this stage. Women is the common property of man, the spoil of the strongest and the mightiest, who chooses the most winsome for his own, a sort of instinctual sexual selection of the fittest. Women is the chattel, an article of commerce, exchange, or gifts, a vessel for sensual gratification, an implement for toil. The presence of shame in the manifestations and exercise of the sexual functions, and of modesty in the mutual relations between the sexes are the foundations of morality. Thence arises the desire to cover the nakedness, and they saw they were naked, and to perform the act in private. And the author goes on and on. Who wrote this?
Darwin.
Sounds like Darwin, yep. Sounds like Darwin, but it isn't. It sounds like Herbert Spencer, but it isn't. Krafft-Ebing. This is from the Introduction to Psychopathia Sexualis. And it could be stood on its head, almost, and you can read it almost line for line out of Civilization and its Discontents, but turned upside down. Okay, this Krafft-Ebing is an enormous influence on Freud in multiple ways. One is Krafft-Ebing is the first, along perhaps with Havelock Ellis a little later, to say sex is an object of reasonable study and professional study. Perhaps for Krafft-Ebing, it's a branch of medical study. So Freud is picking up, including his evolutionary ideas, from Krafft-Ebing, and places himself thereby in the middle of Viennese medical culture. He also keeps going back to what we have to remember is Freud's version of evolutionary biology. And Freud's idea of the heterosexual intercourse, that is reproductive intercourse, and he's very specific about the idea of reproductive intercourse as central. That is, the fact that it's a man and a woman, the fact that it's penis, vagina, that ain't enough for it to. By genital, he means generative. And he argues, in essence, that of course that's true, because in a rather simple-minded version of evolutionary theory, that which reproduces offspring is what's going to survive. So it becomes normative in the sense that it continues to exist. I should mention that in current discourse, in terms of evolutionary psychology, we find that the same basic principle is used only in a slightly more sophisticated version. So that when it's argued, for example, the same-sex desire has an evolutionary value because it produces uncles who will take care of offspring and share a quarter of their genetic content. That argument is the same as Freud's argument. It has the same basic principle. So we've got Freud borrowing from evolutionary theory, from contemporary biology and embryology, from the reductionist position from which he comes. And then we ask, what other historical ideas coalesce? What other contexts do we see Freud operating in? One of the things he fails to mention is the societal context. That is, he's in the midst of Vienna, he's an Eastern European Jew who's trying not to be an Eastern European Jew, who's trying to overcome that background in this sexually very active, somewhat wild environment, and he says, there's no context here. This is, Vienna is, you know, is like Kansas. People are people. It's all the same. So he tries to, he succeeds in ignoring the specific political, cultural context he's in. He succeeds in ignoring something that's particularly striking. When you read his case histories of hysteria, and when you read Dora, and when you read the biography of Jane Addams, you come to something very striking, which is every single one of the cases I've mentioned, most of Weir Mitchell's cases in the United States, most of Freud's cases, have an identical background in terms of the women. The women are all bright young women who are partially educated, who have ambitions in terms of becoming an active part of society, and they find themselves in a position where they're not, where that's blocked. In Freud's cases, over and over again, they're blocked because they're nursing some elderly father who's dying, or sick, not infrequently from tertiary syphilis. What we're seeing is a shift that Freud is ignoring. That is, we're seeing what late 19th century feminism, the notion that women could and should have the opportunity to be part of a larger culture than simply as chattel, as described by Krafft-Ebing, or as instruments of reproduction. And they come up against this difficulty. It literally drives them crazy to be in that position. And Freud says, what does Freud say about all these women? They're sexually repressed, they're frustrated. He makes a move from what his observations support, and which he reports over and over again in his observations, to making it into a matter of sexual, biological frustration. Two quick additional contexts. One is Freud's Jewish context and his relationship to Jewish mysticism and Hasidism, which I bring up because it's one of the few places where you find sexuality, whatever that is, having a meaning, where the task of confronted with the fact of sexual desire, the question arises, does this have a meaning, a symbolic significance, a context in which one can discourse about search after meaning, as it were? And Freud's Jewish background, he claims gives him two things. One is, it gives him this hermeneutic stance, which is what really makes Freud interesting. All this biology would not interest us in the least, I claim, unless it was part of a hermeneutic adventure into the meaning and significance of sexuality. We wouldn't be reading Freud. No one reads Krafft-Ebing anymore. Krafft-Ebing has most of what Freud has to say about biology. But we all, at least all of us here, read Freud because of his hermeneutic efforts. Now, the hermeneutic effort has a peculiar quality to it, which gets us back to Pablo's major point. Because once you start the hermeneutic position, you automatically have to recognize that you're standing somewhere. That is, the view that Freud describes himself as having biologically might be described, as my friend Bert Toller used to call it, as the view from nowhere, as if there were no observer. The moment you recognize that you're engaged in an interpretive activity, you then have to ask, where do I stand as an interpreter? What are my sources of interpretation? Which then I would claim brings us back to attention, in which Freud's study automatically invites us to say, where does Freud come from? How does he do this? That Freud's modern approach, that is modern in the sense that of late 19th century scientism, when addressed from a psychological point of view, then automatically puts him in a postmodern position of asking, how am I doing this? He doesn't do it very obviously in the three essays. He pretends to have a view from nowhere. If, of course, in the interpretation of dreams, written 5 years earlier, you can read that almost entirely as autobiographical discourse. Most of the dreams, which he says, I'm going to look at these because I want a normal subject study, i.e. Sigmund Freud, are enormously revelatory about Freud, and in particular about his own process in writing the interpretation of dreams and the dream interpretation process. So I think what makes Freud on sexuality so interesting, and not simply a sort of 19th century artifact, is the fact that his hermeneutic stance automatically brings him into a postmodern position in which, 108 years after this book is published, it seems quite natural for us to be sitting here trying to think about how he got there and to think about how he influences our own thinking. So, which I would contend is the heart of postmodernism. So, those are my thoughts, and I hope to hear from all of you.
Before we open up for general discussion, I want to give each of our panelists a few minutes to respond to the other's presentation. So, Pablo, if you want to start us off.
I think the reductionism that you point out is there to some extent in the influence of biological thinking, and it's very clear that that's the framework in which Freud is thinking about sexuality. However, I think in a way that becomes a metaphor for something that's historically actually real and happening. So in a way, I think he does have some grasp of the historical transformations that are happening. It's just that he doesn't have that grasp through a real theory of history or a social analysis, but through a kind of distorted mirroring of what's happening in global history through the recapitulation theory.
Well, my thought is you're an optimist with regard to Freud. I came across this most recently in terms of the psychoanalytic theories and thinking about gay men, where there was a tendency not only to obviously wrongly characterize gay men as psychiatrically ill, but even after the shift, there was a kind of universal ahistorical approach that failed to recognize that the context in which men who desire other men live has changed radically, not just overall, but decade by decade. So those of us who came of age in the 60s and 70s, the stereotyped images we have are simply not applicable to men who are in their early 20s now. Their life experience is radically different. And what we see in Freud here, I think, is a foundational problem in psychoanalysis, which is to attempt to make sexuality in people universal, ahistorical, in a way which people simply are not. Now, and the result of that is that with the exception of rather primitive ideas about the impact of history on individuals, you know, it's probably real upsetting if you have family members who've been lynched and you've been in physical danger as a child. But that's such a primitive formulation that I think we see in this work a danger that continues right into contemporary psychoanalysis of a loss of historical perspective. But I want to comment on your work because I don't know what else to say. You know, I just love it. It's absolute. You know, in planning for this, we talked on the phone, and the perspective that you bring to this work as a historian is, at least to me, just enormously stimulating. I'm not sure you're right about some of what you said, but I think it.
I'm not sure I.
Likewise myself, but it brings a perspective to it and a point of view which I hadn't heard before. And I've heard a lot of people talking about analysis, and I think it's really exciting and interesting.
All right, well, we have nearly an hour remaining for discussion, so who would like to be the first to jump into the conversation or ask a question?
I just wanted to read a passage from the foreword to the third edition of the 3 essays, which touches on the question of individual experience and the hermeneutic process in its relationship to the history of the species. I'm translating on the fly from the German, so forgive me for some awkwardness here, but Freud is making the point that everything in this book, everything in these 3 essays should be understood as a result of the psychoanalytic experience. And then he says, everywhere, in the 3 essays that is, everywhere the accidental moments are given priority. Dispositional moments are left in the background. And ontogenetic development is given priority over the phylogenetic. Indeed, the accidental plays the leading role in psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis is almost completely preoccupied with the accidental. The dispositional comes only thereafter into consideration, and as something which is awoken by experience, accidental experience, and whose evaluation, that is the evaluation of the dispositional factors, would take us far from the field, far away from the field of psychoanalysis. A couple of lines later he says, ontogeny can be seen as a recapitulation of phylogeny, insofar as the former, that is, ontogeny, is not altered by a more recent experience.
What was the word for accident?
Accidental. I just can't help but wonder whether that squares with the view of things that you started off with.
The answer is no, it doesn't. And I think here Freud is not being fully honest, because he's correct that in clinical psychoanalysis, the data one gains is largely about what he calls accidental phenomena. That is, a narrative. If you think of this in terms of narrative, there's a normative narrative development, a normative narrative of development, which then is impinged upon by various experiences, and the story that patients tell in their analysis or create in their analysis is largely one about those impingements. So you don't hear, for example, let's say in terms of physical growth. You know, when I was 3, I was this tall. When I was 4, I was this tall, et cetera, et cetera. But if something interferes with the child's physical growth, then you hear a lot of the analysis about that interference. The other, I think what's also implicit in this is the other 19th century embryological concept which Freud makes a great deal of, which is, you'll remember there were these wonderful studies where if you made a specific lesion in the developing embryo, you got new and interesting things in the mature organism. It turns out that that was in large measure an artifact of the methodology. It was one of those things where negative results were discarded. So there were maybe not thousands, but dozens of experiments where he made lesions and nothing in particular uniformly happened. But Freud was very excited about the idea of specific lesions. So I think he's right that he studied, insofar as his data is derived from psychoanalysis, it's about narratives of accidental impingements. I don't believe, reading the entire work, that he's right in describing what he's up to. I think he's trying to have a universal developmental sequence, which indeed he can't get. He's right, he can't get that from analytic data, but he's nonetheless tries to do it. So,
but if that is the case, and he's in fact not giving the kind of attention to accidental impingements that he's claiming one should give them, that would seem to be in tension with what Pablo Ben presented as the what am I thinking back to? I mean, in that case, how are we supposed to understand this particular relationship between the normal and the pathological that he's constructing here, if he's not, in fact, crediting the pathological with specific, with giving it the status of a specific empirically observed instance?
Yeah, but what the pathological gives you information about is normal development. That is, for example, if you take the notion that inversions and perversions result from an interruption of development, then the lens through which he chooses to look at that is, oh, now I can see an aspect of normal development more clearly because I have this this frozen status of I can hear about what that was like. So he's studying impingements and interferences, but he's doing it for the purpose of, as it were, freezing this embryo and saying, what does this embryo look like? I'll reconstruct it. Freud is just awful about looking at actual development. In the introductory paragraphs about little Hans, he says, strictly speaking, I learned nothing new from this close observation of this 5-year-old boy, because I knew it all from reconstruction. Reconstruction, that is, basically, in some sense, the freezing of development by virtue of impingements as it comes out in analysis.
Unless you want to add something.
I'd like to add something. I think the crucial point there is time. And you know, like if you think in the theory of recapitulation, the different people that are finding the same timing and natural evolution, social evolution, the evolution of the individual, the embryology, and they're all finding that there are different stages that go from the asexual or polymorphous to hermaphroditic, and then later, finally, division between male and female and heterosexuality. If you observe that they're coming up with very similar patterns there, but they're not necessarily all reading one another. And it doesn't necessarily fit. I think it's like it's something that's circulating in the time, and there's an interpretation that things are evolving in a certain way, and then that becomes like kind of like a guideline rather than something that you have to, everything you observe, you have to be able to trace it perfectly to the phylogenetic development, and so it's more of a metaphorical relationship with this kind of timing there. And I think that's crucial to observe. I mean, these are people in the late 19th, early 20th century that are seeing how, for instance, from not being connected at all, you're able to travel from one part of the world to another in just a few days because of the development of railways, of the new transportation. So time is accelerating, space is being abolished. There's this phrase, a famous phrase of the 19th century of how you know, the abolishment of space by means of time. And there's a general sense of acceleration there, a general sense of things have a development, things have an evolution, that I think it's coming from that experience. And then that becomes something that gives meaning to a lot of the observations, even if it does in a very metaphorical and sometimes inaccurate way. And that's where you know, the accidents get connected to the underlying, I think, general narrative. I don't know if that answers what you were trying to say.
Marilyn?
Both speakers, I think, mentioned things, aspects that Freud left out in his theory of sexuality and overall, you know, historical, cultural, and of course these are all well taken. But some of Freud's early critics and commentators, and probably quite a few now, I haven't, you know, done specific research into this, spoke of something else that Freud left out in his theory of sexuality. And that was any reference whatsoever or discussion of sensuality. In other words, of sexuality in its relational dimension through human sensuality, which involves relating. Now, Robert mentioned that Freud's female patients, who were all, you know, overwhelmed with the demand that they take care of ill family members and children and so on and so forth. And Freud's reaction was, you know, they were sexually frustrated. And also, one of Freud's patients, the famous one, Anna O., she's the talking cure, Bertha Pappenheim, after she repudiated psychoanalysis, she went about all over Europe trying to persuade the leaders of the Jewish community to condemn the trade in white women that was endemic to Europe at the time. So I think that to consider on any level Freud's theory of sexuality and to seek to understand it hermeneutically, historically, or in any other way, demands that we consider his conception of the relationship between men and women. Pedro mentioned Engels, The Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State. In that book, Engels, echoing Bachhofen, speaks of the world historical defeat of the female gender, something that Marx repudiated. And it may not be well known to many people, but Marx wrote that every society can be evaluated on the basis of the relations between men and women that obtain therein. That was his view. So I think a discussion of Freud's views on sexuality is severely truncated unless it is in the context of the actual relationships between living men and women, both in his time and our own.
Any responses to that?
Some of the tensions that Freud is observing about women are actually happening to everyone, except that they're happening in a stronger way to women. And I think there's a tension there between, on one side, the pressure to become an individual and to be something that's distinct from others, to be someone that can be self-realized, and on the other side, the impossibility and the obstacle to reach that point that is specifically acute for women, but that it's a part of the nature of modernity, and that's emerging in the 19th century for the first time. I mean, I don't know, I tend to think this of, we live in a world, and Greg Gabrielas was referring to this yesterday, we live in a world where our society could be almost fully automatized, and we could probably reach self-realization in a much deeper way than we do today, but instead we're all toiling. And I think that kind of tension between the potential of modernity to abolish work, to abolish toil, to create a creative, emancipatory society on one side, that potential is there in modernity. And on the other side, the obstacles for actually realizing that tension is so big that I think Freud is observing that tension at the level of sexual repression, which is specifically acute for the case of women because they feel these restrictions in a much stronger way than men. But I think in a way, it is something that's happening to men too. It's happening to everyone, not just to women. So I don't know.
I think that's a wonderful formulation. I also think that one of the things we get at when we recognize that Freud is engaged in a sort of hermeneutic adventure is that Freud simply does a lousy job when it comes to women and the relationships between men and women. You know, this endlessly discussed matter of penis envy is first introduced by Freud in the following way. He says, the little boy viewing the female genitals, or interprets them as an absence of a penis. And the little boy imagines that the girl has been castrated and therefore desires to have the penis back. That's the first formulation of penis envy as a young boy's fantasy. Now, somehow in later writings, that gradually moves on to the idea that in fact is what the girl is doing, rather than it exists as a young boy's fantasy. And of course, I don't think it's rude to Freud to say that the young boy is, of course, himself. I think he has the just inordinate difficulty understanding either female sexuality or, and certainly, I like your introduction of the word sensuality at this point. I think he simply doesn't get it. That this is he's thinking as the spirit with which he dissected eels, in some sense, continues throughout his life. At the same time that he led us into the world of subjectivity and the close study of subjectivity, he himself has a really hard time, especially when he's formulating things generally, when he's trying to develop large conceptions that apply to groups of people. He has a devil of a time talking about and thinking about personal experience in an intrusive way.
Just like to make a very quick response. Pedro.
Don't worry,
sorry?
everyone makes that mistake.
I'm
not a saint, though.
Excuse me. So sorry. Pablo. I certainly agree with you that men are situated the way you describe. Nevertheless, when there is a power differential, then one must think about that as part of the equation, the power differential, to put it mildly. Secondly, Robert, you opened by saying, and thank you for your appreciation of my remarks, which is certainly consistent with what you said. But I would like to say this. You began by saying that Freud does a lousy job of it. Well, from a broad perspective, I think that philosophically, at least the tradition I'm in, and I've written about this, the natural scientific worldview in its positivist phase, which is what Freud was embedded in, okay, bears within it a repudiation of these dimensions of human experience and sensuality, that it is built into the positivist worldview. So it's not just a matter of doing a lousy job, it's a matter of one's fundamental metaphysical assumptions as well.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct. I think it's what I was trying to get at, with the notion that he keeps looking at things, in quotes, objectively from a point of view distant, at the same moment that he has this amazing capacity to talk about individuals' experiences. But the moment he gets to theory, he's trying to be an objective scientist, and you can't include the kind of thing you're talking about.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd like to say something in defense of universalistic knowledge claims as against the historicizing tendencies of Pablo, especially Robert's presentation. On the one hand, I really appreciate those historicist tendencies because all too often universalistic knowledge claims are simply transformed culturally, historically, and psychologically specific realities into natural laws with unfortunate effects. On the other hand, I think we should be skeptical of a tendency to respond to that essentializing of historical and culturally specific realities with a kind of postmodernist relativism that leaves us without any criteria in the light of which to evaluate either individual or cultural development. So with respect to the concept of sexuality in particular, and Foucault's deconstruction of it, and which Leo last night endorsed, and which you also endorsed, Pablo, I'm not sure that there isn't a common core to sexuality across all different cultures. And yet in such a way that one is allowed, we still distinguish sexuality from something else. I'm not sure what that common core is, but I think it's an open empirical and anthropological question, and shouldn't be dismissed arbitrarily in the name of postmodernism.
So what do you think? Can we have universalistic knowledge?
You want to do this?
I think that when you observe, like, the historical context, it's just striking how much more you can explain that if you try to see it as a universalistic point of view. But to make one clarification, I actually don't agree with a lot of the things that Foucault says, and I don't think this is just a discursive transformation as Foucault sees it. I think it's a real historical transformation. I don't think that sexuality is merely a fiction. I think it's experienced as I think it's a sphere of social life that has to do, that emerges together with the transformations of modernity, and it's not just something that physicians are saying, but something that people are experiencing in different ways. And in that sense, I believe that I'm not a total relativist, and I believe that knowledge needs to be grounded, but I think it has to be historically grounded rather than universal. I don't think my view is postmodern in that sense. If anything, I think I'm coming more from historical materialism than postmodernism.
Another way of looking at this is assuming there is something essential about sexuality. That is, if you rub certain parts of the body, it feels good. And we have that in common with lemurs and crocodiles and whatnot. And that's certainly true. Now the question is, what proportion of this fascinating field that everyone spends so much time on can be interestingly described in terms of that sort of biological description, and I think it's a relatively small proportion. That I assume that when two people make love, their experience is so distant from a crocodile copulating with another crocodile that although there are important similarities, those similarities are not should not be the basis of what we're doing. You also, in passing, raise a very important question, which we'll talk about some this evening in what kind of science panel. But on what basis is one to judge the satisfactoriness of an explanation, whether it be clinically or theoretically? And without getting into it very elaborately, a very different vision from the scientific description is in terms of the satisfactoriness of narratives, that one can have a notion that's fairly rigorous of what constitutes a satisfactory narrative about the subject, which is a very different matter, I think, from what constitutes, let's say, an adequate theory in chemistry. So, but I don't want to go too far into that.
Okay, so I actually have several points that I'd like to make. One, just with respect to the universality, I couldn't help but think about Durkheim's project that was going on at about the same time, and also very much, at least in some respects, wedded to a kind of scientism, a kind of project of creating a new science of sociology. And so in doing that, also making claims that today strike us as very broad and very general. And so there is something shared there, I think, between Freud and Durkheim, and also, I mean, in a sense, I think, corroborates at least partially the claim that there's an important kind of scientific momentum to the work of both that at least I think accounts for this impetus toward universality. And then on this question of men and women, I think it's fascinating that the post-structuralist critique of Freud, coming from a very different direction, is that in fact Freud unfortunately reifies categories of men and women, right? That, you know, the theory of a kind of primary bisexuality makes, I should say, takes us along a trajectory that Judith Butler and others, for example, would like to resist, right? Which is that we really only understand sexuality in terms of men and women, when in fact the universe of identifications and attractions, right, is much broader than that. But actually, maybe I wanted to go back to this point of the accidental, because when I thought about the accidental, whether rightly or wrongly or usefully or not, I began to think about the contingent and to think about culture, and just to pick up on the categories of the biological and the cultural, which came out particularly in your talk, Bob. And you know, whether or not, you know, Freud's work taken as a whole pushes us beyond those categories, beyond the categories of biology on the one hand and culture on the other. You know, I think about, on the one hand, we have the, you know, I agree, importance of this theory of recapitulation, of ontogeny recapitulating phylogeny, which is a theory that's coming out of embryology, and there are plenty of statements that one can find in Freud, as you were suggesting, that lay us down something of a biological determinist tract, anatomy is destiny. But on the other hand, there's, I think, this really rich story of the development of the individual, and not only with respect to sexuality, right, but more broadly with respect to the constitution of a person, right, of the individual. And part of that, as you pointed out, Bob, is this kind of looping of culture, right, into the creation of the self, you know, in a way that I think comes very much any attempt to hold the biological and the cultural apart. And I suppose, I don't know if this is a question so much as just a comment, but, well, I'll make it a question. I mean, do you think that Freud's work, and particularly within the context of his developmental theory of the self, do you think that it does complicate the familiar binary of biology and culture, and in fact is pushing toward a third category, if you will, which I think in a powerful way really transcends a Cartesian dualism, right, between the material and the immaterial. So.
Yeah, you see, I think, and let me give you a less good answer than I'd like, because it's off the top of my head, obviously. But you see, I think Freud remains very much a dualist himself. And he sticks with that like nobody's business. But at the same time, and this was what I was referring to, the built-in self-critique that we first see in the interpretation of Freud, that the nature of the work overall is such that it forces a kind of next step you're describing. That is, it's not a point that Freud comes to own, yet if you the major force of his work is to say, what is it like to be a biological organism embedded in culture? And how does the individual, with certain biological givens, integrate, react to, become part of culture, and become, whether you want to call it civilized or mature or whatever. And of course, the interesting things one talks about are mostly things that you can't talk about in terms of biology, like the experience of the self, or the notion. I keep coming back to alligators. I don't think alligators experience desire. That may be cruel and unfair to alligators. But I think, seriously, the Freudian corpus forces us in exactly the direction you're describing, while at the same time, poor old Freud never quite realizes that.
I'd like to both do like a critique and vindication of positivism, universalism, science, 19th century science. I think on one side we need to detach ourselves from that, and especially from what Clifford Geertz called the I am a camera point of view. So I take a picture here, and I take a picture there, and it looks the same. So he talks about, for instance, the contraction of the lids. I can contract the lids to wink, and that can mean like I'm making an ironic comment, but also like in a playing cards, it can mean like something absolutely different. Or if I'm rehearsing how to do it, because I don't do it well, against the mirror, that has a completely different meaning. So the exact physical movement has completely different social implications as a social action. But an I am a camera point of view misses that fact. So I think when we go to the history of sexuality, we can see, what we call sexual acts all throughout history. Now, do they mean exactly the same? Are they sexuality in the sense that we understand sexuality, in the sense that we interpret sexuality as something that's the truth of our being? In that sense, I think Foucault has a huge insight there. So let me mention one example from the 16th century in Japan. Anne Walther investigated, for instance, she did research on masturbation in Japan and in the 16th century, and she says, well, the books that I've read, I find that masturbation is mostly among women only, and it's they recognize the orgasm, but it's not really described, and it's not really there, and it matters as something that produces a liquid to drink for health purposes. That's not masturbation. Now, if you take a picture of that, and you take a picture of a woman masturbating today, it's going to look the same. But that's the I am a camera point of view that kind of universalizes everything. I think you have to see the historical context. That's the criticism of positivism. But on the other side, I think there's a risk of understanding of positivism as pure false consciousness. Like everything positivism says is just a total myth and it's a total misrepresentation. And I think there's something that the 19th century grasped that had to do with the transition to modernity that's brilliant, that sometimes we cannot grasp today. And for instance, Penny's envy, I think it's brilliant. I mean, Freud lives in a moment where states, for the first time, are watching people's genitals and are saying, okay, stamp here, man, stamp here, woman, because you have a penis or you don't have a penis. So there's a police state that's watching, and still, this is still happening, it's watching all of our genitals and stamping IDs and telling us who we are, men or women. Now, born in that context, and you don't have a penis, wouldn't you really like to have one of those that gives you this idea and that allows you to go to the university and to do this and to do that? So is it really so surprising that little girls went to Freud and said, I would really love to have a penis? I don't find it so surprising. I think that's something that Freud is seeing there, and it is really observing the power differential in a way. So of course this comes up in a way that's really distorted and positivistic, and it's covered by a scientific discourse that sounds like so foreign to us today. But is it pure false consciousness? Or is he really grasping a historical transformation that's happening there? Is he really grasping a phenomenon that takes place? So at the same time, I think we have to distrust the positivist view, but we don't have to think that it's pure false understanding of reality. That I think there's something there that's a threat of what was happening at the time. And Freud grasps that. I don't know if it makes sense. But.
Yeah. Okay, so we have 15 minutes left. I want to throw out a question to sort of try to turn up the volume on the conversation a little bit or something. So Freud says in these essays that there's this thing, the libido, that's this force in nature that can explain things about what human beings do. Does anyone in here want to defend that idea? Go for it.
I think the problem when we talk about context and history with Foucault is that you actually get a digital idea of like what the historical context is. So there's this like period that starts at a specific date and like is still going on. But the problem is like then you have like a couple problems. One is that within the digital period there are differences that can't be accounted for. One of those would be the difference between a form of sexuality that we have now when we can reflect upon the like Foucault changed sexuality, right? But he can't account for how his own theory changed how people deal about sex. It also can't account for like a future where everyone's a porn star, which we're almost certainly heading towards, right? Another one is the problem is like it can't account. The second problem would be that it couldn't account for connections backwards in history. So like seeing the similarities in like homosexual behavior, say between like gay men now, like samurais in Japan, and like Cathari, like the Cathars went around in these like homosexual like groups of two and they couldn't have reproductive sex. So there's some pattern there that's in history that we can't see if we have this idea, unless we have some sort of like underlying like vital current that's pushing all of those forward. And that's like, the defense of the libido would be the defense of that like energy that gets transformed over time, which can also help us account for like the different instantiations and context of that energy. So we don't have to give up history and still have the force.
Can we still have the force? Is there an energy that exists throughout time?
I'm going to throw something out there.
Sure.
It seems to me that, when you talk about things that we do, okay, so there's actions, there's things, and then the question is it like libidinally charged or not? Does it have like, can you say there's libidinal valence to a particular activity? And when we sit there and go from just the concept of like kind of generative intercourse, as you had called out, as like kind of our base functionality, but then all of a sudden now here's this huge, this polymorphism of activities that suddenly are libidinally charged. It seems that in a lot of ways, you know, as you start looking into all these varying things that go on out there, there can be a correlation between the fact that something is libidinally charged and I guess you can kind of refer to it as whether it be individual, cultural, societal baggage compared to what we are now versus, say, like our original environment of evolutionary adaptiveness, and how rapidly society has changed and how that's kind of messing with our heads a little bit. I'm not sure if that's getting that out totally the way I wanted to, but I'll stop there.
A question might be raised. We certainly see something or other which seems to go on a lot and have great and whether we're constructing its connection to history or whether it's lasting through history, I certainly can't tease out well. But you see, is that Freud has a notion that it arises through the transformation of biology into psychology, and that's his basic concept. I think the data would be more in the direction that there's some kind of idea, perhaps you might call it a meme, something that's enormously powerful that lasts over time, that is regardless of its origin, is part of our mental activity, which we have in common. And its relationship to biology is really pretty obscure, except in the one sense you were referring to, which is that we have limited means of expression. So, for example, it's very hard to be sensual outside of a body. You know, sensual experience requires body. By iPhones? Okay, I forgot the universal porn star opportunity. But
have you ever been on Tumblr? Go to Tumblr and everyone will be a porn star. It's not like it's the future. I swear to God, it's not a joke.
But you have pictures. There are pictures on Tumblr. Movies. Okay. So what you can't make the movies without a body. You know, you need your body to make, to be on YouTube or Tumblr or whatever. Think of how difficult it would be to express sensuality of any type without having a body. But that doesn't mean that that what's being transmitted is something of the body.
But the body isn't what has sex. When people,
Pardon? I'm sorry?
Are you including voice?
yeah.
I mean, what about the unattached voice? Like, for example, phone sex.
Yeah, okay.
Is that still the body? How are you defining
What
the
about
body?
poetry? Is that the body?
The
Are we going to make, I mean, we
the
can't make an argument
poetry's
on the
like
absence
phone
of
sex.
places a lot of my work in a very different light.
But what I'm trying to say is the fact that one uses one's body to do something doesn't mean that what's being done is about the body. It's just as verbal expression and written expression originate in the respiratory apparatus, but we don't think of speech and language as a respiratory function, right? Similarly, a lot of what we think of as sensuality and sexuality has to do with genitals, but that doesn't mean that it's a function of the genitals. So the connection is not that this lasting thing need not be the body itself expressed, but rather expression that uses the body. Which is a lot more than I have ever been.
Here, this is a kind of a weird question, but the other night Noah had a focus on Neanderthals and pointed out the percentages of human beings that do have Neanderthal DNA, and obviously there was sex between Neanderthals and humans before the Neanderthals were banished from Europe. And I'm just wondering, would this have would Freudianism have any kind of analysis of such a thing, or how would it relate to it seems like everything that's been talked about here today, which is fascinating, is over-intellectualizing if you come to something like sex between humans and Neanderthals. Or is this wrong? I suppose you could carry it into humans and animals as well. There's definitely not the same species.
Well, Freud says in the text, basically, some people get turned on by virtually anything, and so whether it's Neanderthals or tables, it's all within our capacities.
You raised an interesting question to me. The relationship of biology to psychology. Are you saying that, in essence, that Freud is really a determinist, of not only a biological determinist, but also a psychological determinist?
I think for most of his writing he is. Yeah.
I think you ask an interesting question about the libidos. I want to get back to that and wonder, and I'm probably influenced here by somebody like Niels Bohr, who said, it really isn't interesting to say, what is it? It's really more interesting to say, well, what would happen? Or how does it lead to more productive thinking? If we ask the question, if we think of it as a wave or we think of it as a particle, does it lead to more productive conversations? And this sort of gets, in a sidebar, gets back to, I think, some of the points you were making, Bob, about evidence. What is our evidence and what was Freud's evidence? But I guess the question I'd have about the libido is, interesting to me, question about the libido is, why do we not talk about, why do we not use it now? Why, in psychoanalysis, we do not talk about it. It has been relegated to one side, identified with mechanistic models and so on. And that's an interesting question. That gets to the sort of social context of today. We don't use it. And why not? It's almost as if we'd be embarrassed to use it. So I think, maybe that's it. You'd like to answer that.
I think we're embarrassed of the kind of scientist smell of the word. But in that sense, I think we should relate to the word conceptually and metaphorically in the way that I was saying before. I think there's an experience of the individual in modernity that, when Freud is writing this, we're seeing the consolidation, the formation of the individual. And on one side, you're supposed to be unique. You're supposed to be a person that's distinct from all other people. This is happening right at the time where you're seeing huge process of standardization. So people who actually carried on in the past, in the, say, early 19th century, handcraft that were absolutely different from one another are being pushed into factories where they do boom, boom, boom. And not only in factories, which is what Marx is describing with the concept of alienation, but you can see this, like, even in transportation. You used to have like a very diverse types of transportation where going on a horse or on a cart, you could experience very different terrains, and it was qualitatively different to travel in one space and in another. With the train,
it all becomes standardized, and really you don't feel the difference in the soil or anything else. Schimmelbusch works on this, for instance, in his history of the train. All traveling becomes the same just everywhere. So there's a standardization of experience at the same time that as individuals we're required to be unique and different. And I think the way that is resolved in since the late 19th century is into sexuality as that thing that actually makes us different and unique. And that's why I think it becomes the truth of our being. So my difference with Foucault there is that I don't think this is a discursive thing carried on by the medical corporation. I think this is part of a social transformation that's happening at the time. It has to do with the rise of capitalist modernity rather than but in that context, you see that people experience an impulse, which I think we can call libido, which is an impulse, a drive towards different kinds of sexual activities that they identified as what defines them as unique, as individuals that are different from other individuals. And I think it's coming from that kind of context there. Of course, if we try to see this in a scientific way, as something that's derived from biology, it's almost impossible to understand it. So I think we're embarrassed of that, and we cannot embrace that concept because of that. But if we can understand it in a historical way, I think it becomes a lot more productive.
Well, I think you can have the last word.
Oh, okay. So
what is it? Why are we embarrassed to use the loop?
Oh, okay. Going back to what Bonnie said, the goodness of the theory is how well it works to explain things that are of interest. And it seems to me that at this point in history, all of us pretty much know and are comfortable with the notion that people want to do things a lot, which is the core of the libido theory. It's simply a word, a rather funny word for saying that people have strong wishes and desires. And so it's a confusing terminology, I believe, at this point. It also doesn't do a heck of a lot for us in other ways. The two places where it comes up are in terms of the developmental line of the libido. Again, that can be said in plain English. There's a time when it's fun to suck. It's a time when defecating feels particularly good. There's a time when stimulating the genitals gets more interesting. There's a time when directing sensual pleasure to involve another person becomes particularly strong. So you don't need the word. And finally, the only third place where I think libido theory comes in is in terms of trauma, of too much libido which overwhelms the individual. And again, I think you don't need the general concept. There are times when things get to be too much, and that gets very distressing, and there's some experience of potential loss of a coherent self. So I think the reason it died is precisely in Niels Bohr's formulation. It doesn't do much for us.
It's no longer useful.
No.
All right, well, thanks everyone for